Thank you for coming. My name is Paul Grandal. I'm the Opalka Endowed Director of the New York State Writers Institute here at the University at Albany. And before we introduce our very special guest, playwright Lynn Nottage, let me say a few words about the Burian Lecture. This is the 27th Annual Burian Lecture. It's been a wonderful collaboration between the Writers Institute and UAlbany's theater program. This annual lecture is funded by an endowment established by the late Yarka and Grace Susan Burian, and it honors the couple's long and influential service to the university. Yarka Burian was the former department chair and professor emeritus of theater at UAlbany and the leading American scholar of Czech theater. Yarka served on the UAlbany faculty from 1955 to 1993. Amazing. And he died in 2005. Grace Burian received her BA and MA degrees from UAlbany, where she taught for many years. She also was the longtime director of the theater program at Schenectady County Community College, and she died in 2023. Past Burian lecturers have included Tina Howe, Ruby Dee, Wallace Shawn, A.R. Gurney, Rita Moreno, Coleman Domingo, Chris Durang, Dale Orlander Smith, Charlene Woodard, Ruben Santiago Hudson, and many others. We are very honored to add Lynn Nottage to that illustrious list tonight. Yeah. Now let me introduce our host and moderator for this evening's program, my colleague and friend Kate Walat. She is an associate professor, theater program director, and resident playwright of the Department of Music and Theater here at UAlbany. Please welcome to the stage Kate Walat.
Hi everyone, thanks for being here tonight. Lynn Nottage is a leading artist of our American theater, a playwright with a masterful command of theatrical craft and incredible sense of dramatic storytelling. She's the first and only woman to have twice won the Pulitzer Prize for drama, for Ruined in 2009 and Sweat in 2017, both powerhouse dramas inspired by real lives and showing her amazing ability for seeking out the stories of people who've been marginalized, bringing them to life on our stages, and making us care deeply for them. As a young writer just out of school, Nottage worked at Amnesty International, and politics, both global and local, have long defined her work. In 2005, she became the most produced playwright in America that season, when her play Intimate Apparel hit stages across the country. After its off-Broadway debut with the then little-known actor Viola Davis in the central role of Esther, a seamstress in 1905 New York. That play was originally inspired by a black and white photo that Nottage had discovered at her grandmother's home in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. Nottage writes, "It was the first time I had ever seen an image of my great-grandmother Ethel, a striking woman with high West African cheekbones and a gentle intensity. She had been a seamstress from Barbados, who at the age of 18 arrived alone in New York City." But as Nottage began doing research for her play at the New York Public Library, she found that the lives of black working women in the early 1900s were woefully absent from the archive. While researching Intimate Apparel, Nottage was also crafting a companion piece, this time a raucous comedy set in contemporary New York, again centered around an African-American woman, this time first played by the ever-fabulous Albany native Charlene Woodard, and appropriately entitled Fabulation. With these two plays launched into production, Lynn Nottage was awarded a prestigious MacArthur Genius Grant and used part of her fellowship to travel to a refugee camp in East Africa, where she hoped to find inspiration for an adaptation of Brecht's Mother Courage. Instead, with the stories of the women she interviewed there, victims of sexual violence and genital mutilation from the Congo Civil War, she found inspiration for her Pulitzer Prize-winning drama, Ruined, set in the bar and brothel of Mama Nadi, who both protects and prostitutes the women she's seeking shelter there. Next, Nottage turns her sight to America and uses the same technique of interviewing real people and creating her work, this time much closer to home in Reading, Pennsylvania, a city that in 2011 was declared one of the poorest in America. A series of visits over 2 years' time to this Rust Belt city gives rise to another pair of companion plays, the intense drama Sweat and its counterbalancing comedy, Clydes. Sweat, which I know many of you saw in production last year at the Rep, takes place almost entirely at a local bar where coworkers gather after their long shifts at the factory to unwind, and later, when they're on strike, to find solidarity. Its approach is intimate, a small group of interconnected people making choices about their lives, but the scope is massive, taking on economics, racism, issues of labor, and the disappearance of the middle class in America. This play gave Lynn Nottage her Broadway debut and earned her second Pulitzer Prize for drama. But perhaps more meaningful was when Nottage and her cast and crew got into vans and drove to Reading to perform the play for the people whose stories inspired it. As the play ended, the audience of over 500 immediately got to their feet. The hour-and-a-half talkback that followed, Nottage said, felt like church. Nottage's Clydes, which we produced here on this very stage a year and a half ago, is set in the kitchen of a truck-stop sandwich shop and was inspired by the formerly incarcerated individuals that Nottage interviewed while in Reading, struggling to find work and their place in society. And yes, the characters in Clydes were all struggling, in some cases with basic needs, but they were also dedicating every fiber of their being to creating the perfect sandwich. And it is the way that Lynn Nottage manages to bring their full humanity to the stage and to craft a play that is dramatically transformative and deeply entertaining, socially significant and outrageously humorous, that allows her to reach so many audience members and to redefine who will be represented on our American stages. We're so thrilled to have her here with us in Albany today. Let's give a warm welcome to Lynn Nottage.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. It's truly an honor to be part of this lecture series, and thank you for this lovely invitation to be here tonight. And I just was going to do a very brief reading, and I was thinking a lot about what I wanted to share in this very precarious moment when so much of what we have taken for granted is under threat, when really our pillars of intellectual thought and creativity are under siege, and we're gently capitulating rather than pushing back. I wrote a play, as mentioned, Sweat, years ago, in 2015, which many said was the first play that predicted the climate that would lead to the election of Trump. And I thought it might be appropriate to visit some of those voices, which were inspired by interviews that I did with people in Reading, Pennsylvania. And so the play, for those of you who might not have seen it here, is about a group of friends who work at a metal tubing factory, who get locked out of that very factory where most of them have worked for between 25 to 40 years. And what happens over the course of time is that their friendships begin to fracture along financial but also racial lines. And so the first monologue, I thought I'd just share, I think, 4 or 5 of their voices. And the first monologue is from Tracy, who's a factory worker, who has stepped outside of the local bar to smoke a cigarette. And she's approached by Oscar, who's a young Colombian busboy who has just received a flyer announcing that they're hiring non-union workers at the factory where she works. And she becomes very threatened and lashes out at Oscar, who she doesn't feel really has a right to work in this factory. And so Oscar says, "I was born here." Tracy says, "Still, you wasn't born here, Berks." Oscar says, "Yeah, I was." Tracy says, "Yeah, well, my family has been here. My family has been here a long time, since the 20s, okay? They built the house that I live in. They built this town. My grandfather was German, and he could build anything, cabinets, fine furniture, anything. And he had these amazing hands, sturdy, meaty, real firm. And you couldn't shake his hand without feeling his presence, feeling his power. And those hands, let me tell you, they were solid worker hands, you know? And they really, really knew how to make things, beautiful things. I'm not talking about now, how you got these guys who can patch a hole with spackle and think they're the shit. My grandfather was the real thing, a craftsman. And I remember when I was a kid, I mean 8 or 9, we'd go down to Penn with Opa to walk and look in the store windows. And downtown was real nice back then. You'd get dressed up to go shopping. You know, Pomeroy's and Whitney's, whatever. And it felt really special because he was this big, strapping man, and people gave him room. But what I really loved was that he'd take me to office buildings, banks, you name it, and he'd point out the woodwork. And if you got really, really close, he'd show you some detail that he'd carved just for me, an apple blossom. Really, that's what I'm talking about. It was back when if you worked with your hands, people respected you for it. It was a gift. But now, there's nothing on Penn. You go into the buildings and the walls are covered over with sheetrock and the wood is painted gray or some ungodly color, and it just makes me sad. It makes me whatever. Listen, that piece of paper that you're holding, that flyer, it's an insult. It doesn't mean anything. Ulstead isn't for you. And then a little later in the play, Oscar gets to respond to the fact that the factory workers have basically ignored his presence in the bar, even though he's the person in the bar who's working hardest, and he's always there. And so he's decided in retaliation that he's going to cross the picket line to take the coveted work in the steel factory. And so Oscar says, "Why are you coming for me? I'm not disrespecting you. I'm just trying to get paid. That's all. For 3 years, I've been carrying nothing but crates. I've got $20 bills taped to the wall and a drawer of motivational tapes. I got a jar full of Buena Suerte from the Botanica and a candle that I keep lit 24/7. I keep asking for some good fortune. That's it, just a little bit of money. That's it. My father, he swept floors up in the factory like Ulstead's, and those fuckers wouldn't even give him a union card. But he woke up every morning at 4 a.m. because he wanted a job in the steel factory. It was the American way. So he swept those fucking floors thinking one day they'll let me in. I know how he feels. People come in here every day. They brush by me without seeing me. No hello, Oscar. And if they don't see me, I don't need to see them." And then we meet another character who's Brucey, who's an African-American textile worker who's been locked out of his factory for over a year, out of work, and he's desperate and he's just fighting to stay sober. But he keeps coming up against all of these obstacles, and his response is to turn to opioids for comfort. And Brucey shares his predicament with his friend Stan. And so Brucey says, "Last week, I was at the union office signing up for some bullshit training, and this white cat, whatever, gets in my face talking about how we took his job." We? I asked him, who was he talking about? And he pointed to me. And so I said, "If you ain't noticed, I'm in the same fucking line as you. Hello?" You'd think that that would shut him up, but no, he goes on and on about us coming here and ruining everything like I'm fresh off the boat and shit. He don't know my biography. October 2nd, 1952. My father picked his last bale of cotton. He packed his razor and a Bible and he headed north. 10 days later, he had a job at Dixon's Hosieries, and he clawed his way up from the filth of the yard to union rep, fighting for assholes like that guy. So I don't understand it, this damn blame game. I got enough of that in my marriage. And then we find Jesse, who's another one of the factory workers, a white woman, and she's a little tipsy, and she's sitting on a bar stool, and it's her birthday, and her friends have all arrived really, really late, and she feels totally abandoned. She's been working at the same factory for 25 years, and she had once planned something else, but now she drinks too much and is slowly letting go of all of her hope. And so Jessie says, guess how old I was when I started the factory, Stan? 18. 18. Can you believe it? The summer I started, I was a couple years younger than you guys. God, that was a summer, huh? A lot of fun. I wasn't thinking about anything. I'd figure I'd be at Olsted's for 6 to 8 months, max. Can you believe it? I was collecting green stamps the whole year. You remember green stamps? I was gonna trade them in for a backpack and a tent. We had like 1,000 of them. I was going to hitch my way across the country with my boyfriend, Felix, and we planned to wind up in Alaska where my dad was working at a cannery in Kodiak. He split for Alaska when I was 13. A lot of folks went up there that summer. God, me, Felix, that was so long ago. We were gonna go to Alaska, camp, live clean, you know, and save enough money to get to India, live in an ashram for a while, then bum along the hippie trail, Istanbul, Tehran, Kandahar, Kabul, Peshawar, Lahore, Kathmandu, places. Still remember them all. I used to say them every night like a mantra, like a prayer. Istanbul, Tehran, Kandahar, Kabul, Peshawar, Lahore, Kathmandu. I mapped the whole thing out, yeah. We had this world map from the World Book that Felix had ripped out of the atlas in the library. The World Book. God, that was the plan. Jason says, why didn't you go? Jessie says, started working, met Dan. I guess I got caught in the riptide, couldn't get back to shore. That's how it is. Chris says, you ever sorry? And then Jessie weighs the question for a long time. She says, yeah, I guess I wish I had gotten to see the world, you know? Left Berks, if only for a year. That's what I regret, not the work. I regret the fact that for a little while, it seemed like, I don't know, there was possibility. I think about that Jessie on the other side of the world and what she would have seen. Whoa, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get emotional. I didn't see that coming. But you don't know what you don't know until you want to know, right? And then it's too late. Istanbul, Tehran, Kandahar, Kabul, Peshawar, Lahore, Kathmandu. And then finally, there's Cynthia, who's a Black woman who takes a job in management thinking that she can help out her fellow workers. But she's told once she takes the job that she's going to have to lay off all of her friends. The company wants to save money by taking the factory elsewhere. And now all of her white friends are blaming her. And Cynthia is chatting with Stan, and it's her birthday, and no one has shown up. Cynthia's, you know what's crazy? When I started at the plant, it felt like I was invited into an exclusive club. Not many of us folks work there, not us. So when I put on my jacket, I knew I'd accomplished something. I was set. And when I got my green card, you couldn't tell me anything. Sometimes when I was shopping, I would just let my union card slip out of my wallet onto the counter just so that folks could see it. That's how proud I was of it. Stan, yeah, I remember that feeling. Cynthia, right? No one in my family ever made it beyond the factory floor. And I wanted this job so bad. Ever since I stepped into the plant and saw how the white hats left work and clothes as clean as when they walked in, and they seemed untouchable. Stan says, how you holding up? Cynthia, how? Shit. I locked out my friends, Stan. I explained, I fought, I begged, but those cowards upstairs still had me tape a note to the front door telling them they weren't welcome. 95 degrees, and I'm standing in the door watching some irritable guy change the locks. Shut out of the plant. And you know what? I can't help wondering whether they gave me this job on purpose, dump the shit on her so they can stay in their air-conditioned offices. Do you know what it feels like to say to people you've worked with for years that they're not welcome anymore? I haven't slept in over a week. And me, I was just doing my job because Stan says you were given orders, right? Don't say anything. I'm scared. Stan, I got a mortgage to meet, car payments, and Brucey, you've seen what being out of work has done to him. I'm not going down that way. I've worked too hard. Am I wrong? But what could I have done? You tell me. The plant offered them a deal. The union voted it down, not me. Stan says, what do you want me to say, sweetheart? Those were my friends. Cynthia says, those were our friends. I've lived half my life on that floor. My son was practically born in that place, so don't get sanctimonious with me. I would have quit a long time ago if it wasn't for Tracy and Jesse. We've had each other's back since day one. When I was pregnant, I could barely move. I was so sick. And you know what they did? They stepped in to help so Butts wouldn't find out. And Tracy covered my shifts so I could nap in the break room. Remember that nasty couch? Stan says, shit, yeah, smelled like blue cheese. Cynthia says Tracy worked both of our positions like an octopus. That bitch was 4 months pregnant. Nah, I didn't believe it would go this far. I thought they'd take the deal. You think I'm happy about this? I locked my own son out, my own son. I saw the hurt in his face. But you want to know the truth? And this is the truth. Maybe it's for the best, right? He'll finally get out of this shithole. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you.
That was amazing hearing those words and in your own voice. And then also to be hearing the play in, as you said, this political moment, everything seems to have a different resonance or take on greater resonance. In an interview, you once noted that critics sometimes will call out a playwright for writing an idea play or imply that political in front of theater is a bad word. Do you think that in the past 5 years that's changing? Or in our current polarized America, do you think there's a new hunger for political or socially conscious work? Or do you think just the opposite, unfortunately, might be happening?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in that question. And I do think that there was a period of time in which the notion of a political play was a dirty word, and critics weren't welcoming to playwrights who were trying to interrogate what was happening in the moment, and they often labeled the plays didactic or pedagogic and dismissed them. And with regards to Sweat, there was a critic at the Washington Post, Peter Marks, he won't mind me calling him out, but he wrote a review of Sweat when it was in Washington, D.C., and we very specifically wanted the play to be in Washington because we knew there was election going up, and we wanted to have a conversation with folks, and in particular the politicians who, by and large, were ignoring the kind of toxic environment that we felt was growing in the country. And Peter Marks reviewed the play, and he basically said, I don't think this play is relevant. It seems like an old conversation. And I very rarely write to critics, but in this case, I DM'd him, and I said, I don't know which country you're living in, but I interviewed people in Reading, Pennsylvania, and if you're not paying attention, then something is very wrong. And then, we know what happened. And he actually wrote me a letter of apology. Wow. And he said, sometimes we do get it wrong, and I didn't see it. And then he proceeded to travel with us. We took Sweat on the road on throughout the Rust Belt to small cities that didn't have any regional theaters, because we wanted to put people in purple places in dialogue, states that were red and blue, where people were undecided. We thought these are places where we can actually affect some change. And he came with us. And he said it was perhaps one of the most profound theater experiences he's ever had. And so, sometimes it pays to write the critics, which now I do. But and I also, just with regards to political theater, I think that sometimes people think that plays about politics are political, which I think is different than political theater, which is really theater which is pushing audiences to question, interrogate, and to challenge their own assumptions. And I think that now we're living in a time where more and more playwrights are leaning into that notion, and more critics are open to actually listening.
Yeah. That kind of leads into another question I had, which is, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the place of theater in our current society. And do you think that there's something specific about the stage or the American theater that's important as a place to tell these stories, as opposed to other mediums?
Well, I was speaking to students earlier today, and one of the things that I said to them is I really do think that one of the roles as theater artists is to be at the vanguard of the change. We are in a unique position to be in dialogue with audiences and feel the collective energy, and that energy then shapes the way in which we tell our stories. And one of my big regrets is that we as artists aren't quite meeting this moment in the way that we should be. And we are frozen in the proscenium, and with you out there sitting in the darkness and us sitting up here in the light. And I think that in some ways we have to shift that paradigm. And I was talking earlier about theater happening in non-traditional spaces, and I do think that this is a moment in which we do have to sort of pour out of the prosceniums into the world and create theater where people can see it, and create theater that's pushing back at what's happening in this moment. I was talking about when I was a student in graduate school at Yale during the anti-apartheid movement, and one of the things that we did is, rather than marching, is that we created drama that we placed in front of the Yale Corporation, that we placed at the gates of Yale. And so even if people didn't want to encounter us, they were forced to encounter us. And I feel like more of that needs to happen in this moment, that as artists, we have to be more creative in the ways that we meet this moment, because they're creating more obstacles for us. They're they're shutting off one of our main arteries, which is funding. And what we are doing in response is becoming paralyzed, rather than saying, you know what, you can shut off that artery, but we can still make our theater anywhere.
Shifting gears a little bit, I was wondering if you could talk about, there was a moment in January 2022 when you had the triple distinction of simultaneously having two plays running on Broadway, Clyde's and your play Clyde's, and MJ, the musical that about Michael Jackson that you wrote the book for, and your opera version of Intimate Apparel, which you wrote the libretto for, running at Lincoln Center. So first of all, what an amazing moment, and
it was COVID.
Right, and yeah, and it was we're just coming out of the pandemic. So also like kind of an amazing and beautiful moment for the theater and for our society. I wonder if you could talk for a little bit about working in different genres or different mediums, and what your experience is with that, and do you have a place as a writer that feels more at home, or do you like the challenges of working in different ways? And especially for our Writers Institute audience, I think that are interested in a lot of kinds of literature.
Well, first of all, like juggling those three things was intense and supremely exhausting because my days looked like this. I'd get up, I'd go to rehearsal for one show, and then I'd begin uptown, and then I'd go 20 blocks down and to rehearsal for another show, and then I'd go another 6 blocks down for the first previews of a show, in which I would be there until midnight. And then the next morning, I would have to do it again. And that went on for 3 months. And this is true. I had a period from September 1st until March 7th in which I worked every single day, almost from 9 to midnight.
Wow.
The life of an artist.
Aside from the exhaustion, though.
The exhaustion, but it was immensely gratifying, and in some ways, I'm happy that it happened at a point in my life where I felt like I was ready and capable of taking on all of those things, and I was doing work that I loved in 3 very different genres. You know, one being a musical, one being a comedy, and the other being an opera. And you asked, you know, like negotiating those different things. I think that as I get older, my curiosity continues to expand, and I want to exercise different muscles, which is why I've been doing opera. I'm really interested in the expansive ways in which you can tell stories with music and writing librettos that are very economic and really different from the kinds of plays that I was writing, in which, you know, they're 120 plays versus a libretto, which is 35 pages, and you still have to tell a complete story. And so I find that exercise at this age is really challenging in ways that I love.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Let's open it up to the audience. Sean, do you have the microphone that you're able to travel with?
I do. Any questions? Come now, don't be shy. Ah, wonderful. Run.
Thank you, Sean. Hello again. So, earlier in your last lecture earlier today, you talked about how you took a 4-year break from playwriting altogether. I was just wondering if obviously you don't know what you would be doing in a parallel universe if you didn't take that break, but from your experience right now, do you feel like you learn more about yourself taking that 4-year break? And what is the most valuable lesson you learned from that?
Yeah, I took that break. I went directly from undergraduate school to graduate school. And when I landed in graduate school, it was an incredibly intense moment. It was the height of the AIDS epidemic, and crack was ravaging the community. And I was in a school that was particularly hard hit by AIDS. I had friends who were dying. I had professors who were dying. And I thought at that moment, here I am studying theater. I should be doing something else. And so I pivoted, and I ended up doing human rights for 4 years. And that ended up being my second graduate school, and really informed how I wanted to write and the stories that I wanted to write about. And after 4 years of doing that very intense work, I realized, oh, I'm an artist, I'm a playwright. I need to get back to basics. But the basics wove in all of the things that I learned as a human rights activist. And I think that my plays, I can't think of one play that I've written that isn't informed by the experience that I had and the people that I met. And also the kind of compassion and empathy that I developed from being in proximity to people who were going through much greater trauma than I was.
Well, if you wouldn't mind passing, I'm going to skip in the front here. I'm going to this over. I'm going to come to you, right?
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you so much. I'm enjoying this immensely. This is a side note. Your husband gave me a ride home from Brooklyn years ago. He won't remember me, but I remember him because he was with you. I wonder if you might share. My name is Kiragan. I'm a professor here in ethnomusicology. And I wonder if you might, now I forget my question. What's my, I might forget my question. Okay, hold on. Oh, the interviewing. Okay, so I'm an ethnographer, and my question is, where did this idea of interviewing people come from? And if you were to, given what we've gone through in academia, a lot of students are afraid to talk to strangers, afraid to be with people. Any advice for young people about the value of talking to strangers?
Well, I think it's very important in this day and age to be in dialogue with as many people as possible, and so I encourage it. But with regards to doing interviews, I think I really stumbled upon it accidentally, and it began when I was working on a play, Ruined, which is about gender-specific human rights abuses in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it began when myself and collaborator Kate Worski had wanted to do a modern adaptation of Bertolt Brecht's Mother Courage, but set it in the Congo. And we began doing research on the war that was happening there, because Mother Courage is about the 100-year wars in Europe, and we thought there's a parallel war that's going on in the Congo, which has been going on for a very long time, but there's so little information in the newspapers, and particularly about what's happening to women and children. And so on a whim, I said to Kate, I think we actually have to go to East Africa and talk to the women. And I used my contacts because I'd worked at Amnesty International for years, so I knew people who were in this space, and I said to them, I just want to talk to women, and they helped me find all of these women. And when I sat down with them, I didn't have skills, but fortunately my husband, who was a documentary filmmaker, was there, and I just began by saying to them, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a human rights activist, I'm a storyteller, and all I can do is sit and listen to your story from beginning to end and promise that I won't interrupt. And that's what we did, and some of the stories were very, very long, but we had this contract, which was to listen without judgment. And so I also said, I may do nothing with your story, but it ended up being incredibly cathartic for the women, is that afterwards we'd hug and we'd cry and I'd say thank you. And I think in that process, I found my own personal interviewing technique, which was to lead by offering something about myself, and then inviting them to offer something about themselves, and then just listening.
Good evening. I have to say, too, my first college play was Ruined.
Oh,
I played
very cool.
Olsen Benga, so it was fun that you brought that up.
I'm sorry.
I know. Yeah, I was one night. But thank you so much for your wonderful and beautiful artistry. My question to you is, the idea of the Black playwright has changed and evolved and have grown over the years. Now that we're in a time, even on Broadway, not to say that there isn't still a struggle, but we're at a time where many layers of Black culture can be told instead of just through the struggle or trauma porn. Where would you see the level, or where we're at now as the frame of being, of bringing Black stories to life here and now in 2025?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you've answered the question. I mean, we're in this really strange, at once glorious and strange moment, because in the last 5 years we've seen an abundance of Black stories, not just on stage, but in film and television, and as a result, they realize that we aren't a monolith, that there's a diversity of the ways in which we express ourselves, and it doesn't all have to be trauma porn, it could be anything, but I will just express my fear is with this sort of rollback of DEI and with theaters becoming frightened that some of our stories are going to disappear and that we're not going to have the same opportunity, and that there'll be a generation of young playwrights who for 4 or 5 years won't get nurtured, and then they'll disappear. And so while it is a wonderful moment for our stories, I just have to express that I'm afraid.
Yeah. No, thank you.
I'm going to go back. Can I get a hand?
Hello. Earlier you mentioned how when you did your tour of Sweat, you brought it to more like Midwest or like swing states. And that made me think, how often do you think that art and, the theater in specifics has an effect on like the way that, history plays out and things like that?
It's hard to say, but, if it's often said if Morgan Freeman had not been seen as a president, could America have imagined a black man in office? And I think that those things do have impact. The more diverse people you see in a diversity of roles, the more you can imagine those folks in those positions. So I think that art can have a tremendous effect. And I think also, who you center on stage has impact. The fact that I can write a play that centers a black woman and an audience that's predominantly white can watch that woman in all her power has an effect.
Just over here, then you next.
Hi, nice to see you again. Thank you for being here. I wanted to know if you've talked about how with Sweat it was the first play to predict the political environment that happened. You've talked about the deindustrialization in small town cities, and that you had your finger on that pulse that nobody else was paying attention to. And I'm just wondering if there is a particular pulse in our society that you have your finger on that is not getting talked about. Not necessarily what project are you working on, but is there a specific topic that has caught your attention?
Yeah, there are a number of things that I think a lot about. I think a lot about white Christian nationalism and just how that's shaping the dialogue and tone in this country, and how it's not really ever addressed in art. I think a lot about how climate change and how we're not addressing that on the stage. And so there are a few subjects that are very much on my radar that I'm concerned about.
We all look forward to this.
Oh my God, son. I wish my voice sounded like Aaron Moore's. I really love your work. I just assigned a bunch of monologues this week to a bunch of my students. And if you have a cut of Cynthia's from Sweat, send it along. Okay. But you mentioned site-specific work, and it's something I do a lot of. Although the last couple of years, I think I've got a little bit away from it because I've done more development. But my company, we had this plan for this year, and then Trump got elected.
Yeah.
And everything didn't make sense as far as what we were planning on doing. So we threw it all out, and we decided we had to go back to a lot of the guerrilla-style tactics that I think we were doing around 2017. So I really appreciated that because that's kind of, I think we do need to literally bring theater to the people. I'm also not asking what your next project is, but could you and do you see yourself creating that kind of work? Or
I've created a lot of that kind of work. You're talking site-specific work?
Yeah, site-specific, particularly something like large scale.
I've done large scale. I did a piece called This Is Reading. After Sweat, one of the things that we wanted to do is this city that was very fractured along racial and economic lines, we thought as artists, how can we bring the city into dialogue with itself and to, because in Reading there are 4 quadrants, and we thought, why are these 4 quadrants of people so isolated and yet living in the same city, and how can we create a piece of art in which they're forced to be in proximity? And so we tried to identify a place to put it. At first we thought, oh, the supermarket. The supermarket's the most democratic space. It's where everyone goes. And then we couldn't find the supermarket. And then we decided the other most democratic place is the railroad station. Everyone has to pass through.
Yeah.
And so we did this enormous site-specific place which told the story of the city. And we began in a really interesting way because we didn't want to be like these carpetbaggers that come into town and tell people what they should be thinking. But we held a convening in which we had people from all over Reading sitting at a table with us. We had a gamer. And we had an urban anthropologist, and we had a muralist, and we had like as many creative people as we could get at the table. And we began with a question that the gamer put before us, which was, what do the people really desire? And we went out into town and we asked people, well, what do you want? Because I would have done something really dark and and they said, we want spectacle, we want music, we want dance, and we want to be entertained. I thought, oh, okay. And so I thought, this is a little different than my plan, but that's what we built. We built this big, wonderful, very expensive piece that lived in Reading for a month, and our goal was to put, as we said, the person who's living on the street in proximity to the mayor. And at some point, I literally looked in the audience and there was an unhoused man sitting next to the mayor, and I thought, we did it.
Yeah.
And
That's so great.
the other thing that I want to say about this piece, and this is literally not hyperbole, is that it succeeded in that a space that had been abandoned since 1981 was revitalized. And we proved that this downtown area could not only house art, that people would come to it. Because people like, it's too dangerous, no one's gonna come. But you know, we had all of these folks from all over who were there, and it was kind of remarkable. And I have to say, it was one of my most favorite things I've ever done. Huh? And it was free.
Yeah,
it was 100% free. And also, so when we were walking around, I was talking to people, someone said, well, will we be fed? And I thought, yeah. And so we gave people hot dogs.
Thank you.
Come into the back first.
Thank you for being here, for one. I just want to know, what's your creative process for writing plays? I know you're a storyteller, but how do you go into the process?
You know, someone asked me that question earlier, and I wish that I could share a process, but I have no real process. I'm kind of a binge writer. In which I have long periods of time in which I'm just ruminating and thinking and researching and, you know, reading and watching television. And then all of a sudden, like, the idea is there and is really insistent, and then I sit down and write. And that's kind of how I do it. But the one thing that I do try and do is write every single day. And it doesn't mean that I'm writing for an hour. Sometimes it's like a solid, intense 20 minutes. But I feel like if I don't do that for every day, then somehow the muscle will atrophy.
Wow, yeah. Thank you so much.
All right, I'm jumping here.
Hi, thank you for being here. What can you say to us young folk and artists who are feeling isolated in the work that needs to be done, but feeling called to continue and feeling frustrated by our peers?
Are you frustrated by your peers?
Yeah, the lack of urgency, I suppose. Like you mentioned a little bit about the kind of paralyzation of people, and like how do you, like, what can you say to us who are working to move beyond that and effect change?
And so when you're talking about the paralysis? Is it this moment that we're in, or is it like creative paralysis that you feel in a more general way?
I would say both. I think they, in some instances, they kind of go hand in hand in terms of people kind of panicking right now and not knowing like what direction to go to. I think what you mentioned about like feeling like art wasn't enough and you moved to like the oh, my brain's blanking. The other sector that you went into for your other grad school career. I think people are having that same problem of just not knowing if art is enough and then like not really doing anything at all.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a strange moment because I think that the paralysis that you're feeling as a young person is the same paralysis that many of us who are older artists are feeling as well, and not entirely knowing exactly how we can use the tools that we have to address this moment that we're in. You know, what I can say, and I said it earlier, is that I think that there's a real responsibility for us to do something, and particularly as theater artists, is to create, to be in street, to be in dialogue with this moment. And it doesn't have to be huge gestures. It can be tiny gestures within your community. But I think that people are looking, in particular to artists, for some form of leadership, some form of guidance and processing, because I think that the thing that we do best is that we can reflect and refract and process and synthesize and help people move through all of the difficulty that we're going through. And sometimes that's, you know, shouting really loud, or sometimes it's merely making people laugh, because we need that release. It's like just opening our mouths and blowing air out sometimes can relax all of our muscles that allow us to get to the next step. And so that's what I would say, is that we have to continue to do what we do. And that sometimes we think that meeting the moment means, you know, raising our fist in our air and expressing, you know, our rage in a certain way, but I think that there are other ways that we can do it that are equally as important. You know, and sometimes just like being in an audience and reading just the most beautiful poem that provides some, particularly now, some sort of solace or release can be really welcome and necessary.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is John. I wanted to ask, in this day and age now, in a hypothetical situation, how would a young playwright with a completed play, how would they get that? How would they get the ball rolling? How would they get the ball rolling to get it on stage? And how much money would they be sacrificing before they're able to see profit with that play?
Good question. I'm going to be like 100% honest. The economic reality of being a playwright is really difficult. Is that there are only a few playwrights who actually make a living writing plays. And so you don't write plays to get rich. You write plays because you have stories to tell and you want to be in dialogue with your audiences. And sometimes, you know, you hit the jackpot, but most of the times you don't. And you just have to be satisfied by the fact that your art is out there in the world. But how do you get your work out there? For young playwrights, I think that what I tell my students is that you have to submit to 5 things every month. One of those things has to be a festival, one has to be a grant, one has to be a theater, one has to be a residency, and one has to be, you know, whatever. But 5 things, and you do that for a year. And I guarantee you, if you do it for 1 year, you'll get 1 hit. And that hit becomes the door that you walk through. And it's a battle of attrition. It doesn't happen quickly, and you have to be incredibly persistent. And it may take 10 years, and it may take 15 years, but if you're persistent and you invest in your craft, eventually you will get there, but you have to know that it's not going to be easy.
Hi, so Your characters are deeply layered, often carrying intense emotional and physical burdens, especially in stories centered in working class struggles. So I was wondering, what advice would you give actors to fully embody these roles, capturing both their physicality and emotional depth while staying true to their own lived experiences?
Well, I think that part of the work, and I'm not an actor or an acting teacher, but I really do think that in order to find the truthfulness in that characters, it's about sourcing one's own experience. And I know some of the work that we do around the table is having lots of conversations about what are the intentions and who is this character, and spending a lot of time trying to get closer to the emotional reality of that character. And it takes some work, and in some ways that's really the joy of acting, is peeling away all of those layers until you get really close to the core of who that character is.
Amazing. Just to keep us in value for your time, this is Sean over here. We're a little past this, maybe a couple more questions, or if you feel all right with that?
Yeah.
Amazing. So I know I ignored this row for 1 second, and then I'm going to come back out.
Ruined and Sweat and some other of your works you said was based on interviews, and I'm wondering, when you're sitting down with your records of those interviews and writing, how much is taken directly from what people said to you, and where do you decide to let sort of your own craft make its way in, and how do you make that decision?
Well, I'll tell you what my process is. I do the interviews and then I never listen to them again. And so what I take away is what I experience in the room. And yeah.
Thank you. Would you mind passing this down to the middle?
Thank you so much for talking with us and taking the time. I'm working on a play that told me it was going to be a musical, which is making me tear my hair out. So I wanted to ask you about the transition from straight drama and comedy to musical writing and opera writing. How do you change? I know there's supposed to be an I Want song and the various places in the play where the music should take over. But what tips would you have for someone who's trying to navigate those waters?
What I would recommend is reading musicals. And reading as many as possible and watching them. And the I Want song actually is pretty important. I wrote a musical very recently, and we thought, we're not going to write an I Want song. And then, we did a reading of it, and we thought, oh my God, we need an I Want song. And and there are all of these amazing blueprints out there, and it's fun. You can read the musical, and then you can get the cast album and listen to it. And I think that's the best way to do it.
Hello, good evening. I recently went to see Romeo and Juliet in Broadway, and it really changed the way that I see theater and acting, and I really love it. I understand that the acting industry is really competitive. And if I want to follow that path, what piece of advice can you give me?
Oh. Oh, what is the advice? It is very difficult. And I think that one of the things that's really important, particularly if you're a young actor following this path, is really to begin by centering yourself, because it's an industry in which you're going to receive a lot of rejection. And you're going to be told that you're not right a lot. But if you have that center, then you're able to absorb some of that negativity that's going to be placed upon you. And then the other thing that I think is really essential is that you study. Is that you either if you're here, you take as many acting classes as possible. If you're going out into the world, is that you continue to nurture your craft. Because the more you can lean into who you are as an actor, the more confident you're going to be when you walk into the room to audition. And so that would be my advice, is like, before you do anything, is just study your craft.
Thank you.
Maybe one last question on that side of the room, running over there. Sorry, I'm coming from, I had it over here. Apologies.
Thank you so much. I'm curious your thoughts about courage at this time in crafting theater that we take to the community. You've been courageous. This time calls for perhaps another step in that. And your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, I was talking about this earlier, that I had encountered, a woman who'd been part of the women's movement in the 1970s, and she was just feeling really discouraged because she's one of the founders of Ms. Magazine, and she burst into tears. She's like, I did all of this work for 50 years, and now I'm in a moment in which I feel like all of what I have done has completely disappeared or will be erased. And she's like, I don't know what to do in this moment. And the thing that we can do is figure out, well, what is our tolerance for risk? At what point are we willing to put everything in harm's way in order to carve a path for a better future? And I think that part of the problem that we're experiencing right now is that we're living in a place in which we don't want to be uncomfortable. We don't want to challenge ourselves. We don't want to put what we have at risk in order to imagine a better future. And so I do think that courage perhaps is an interesting word to unpack. And we all have a different tolerance, and we have to now interrogate what is our tolerance for risk if we want to fight back.
Sean's out here, and you can't see me at all. Would you like to take any further, or is that where we'd like to
Are we at 8:30, Sean?
We are. We're past that. We've asked a couple more questions.
Okay.
Thank you for that extra time.
Lynn Nottage, this was such an honor to have you here. You have so much to bring to...
Thank you, Kate.